Welcome to episode 11 of my Road to Rapid Top 1000 series. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, I've been in a bit of a slump, so my rating, as you can see here, is not quite as high as I would want it. But the good news is, this win that you're about to see is the start of a little comeback. And this is actually my 100th Rapid win, and the 38th since I've started the series out of 77 games. So let's see how I got it. My opponent opened with d4, and I went for knight f6, and he played bishop f4. And at this point, I could already tell that he was trying to go for a London system. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a very safe, solid way to play with the white pieces. It goes a little something like this. I'm just going to turn the board so I can show you. Black plays d5, a natural move here. White will just play knight f3, and then, for example, e6, e3, knight d7. White will play c3, and then put their bishop on d3, and then follow that up by putting their knight on d2, and then they'll castle. And the way this pawn structure is set up, it's very safe, hard to break from black's side, and also they have some pretty nice bishops slicing the board in opposite directions. But for any good opening, there's a good counter, and you just have to figure out what it is. And I think that I've done exactly that. And in this position, rather than playing d5, and allowing this bishop to have nice scope on this diagonal, I instead played d6 and went into what I like to call the anti-London system. So my opponent here already played kind of a strange move, h3. I guess that he was a little paranoid that my knight was going to harass his bishop and he wanted to be able to retreat it to h2, but playing h3 so early, a little bit strange. So I played knight d7, he played knight f3, and now I went for g6. And this is the second aspect of the anti-London system. Not only am I going to blunt this bishop, but I'm going to blunt the other bishop also, because it's going to be staring into a pawn. And so he plays e3, and I play bishop g7. And here he just played c3, preparing to play bishop d3. I castled, knight d2, and now I played rook e8. Setting a little trap here. This is actually very common in a position like this. If you were to play bishop d3 here, the most natural looking move, I would then come in with e5. And now he would have to play bishop g5, because if he retreats the bishop, then I have e4, forking his knight and bishop, and this pawn is nicely supported by my two pieces. He would be losing a piece. So he would have to, in order to get out of it, play bishop g5 to prevent e4, because then the knight is pinned, and he could just take. But what I could do then is play h6, and he would have to give up this nice bishop, and he would already be at kind of a disadvantage. So he didn't go into this, he instead retreated his bishop, and I now played c6, just kind of expanding a little bit in the center, controlling the square, and he played bishop e2, and as you can see, his bishops are developed, but very passively. They're not doing a whole lot, and this gives me an opportunity to really compete for the center by playing e5. And he decides to take my pawn, and I recaptured with the knight, opening up the light square bishop, and so he castled. And I took his knight, he recaptured, and now d5. I'm slowly expanding in the center. I have this nice pawn chain. I'm controlling this square. Already as of move 12, even with the black pieces, I would prefer my position. And here he played queen to b3, developing the queen, putting some pressure here, and I decided to take this opportunity to occupy a very nice outpost with the knight. It has a great view of d2, g3, putting some pressure here, opening up the bishop. Pretty good for me. And so he now played rook to d1, putting some pressure on this pawn, and now possibly looking to play c4, and I wouldn't be able to take because obviously my queen is in the way. So here I played queen e7, a move that has two purposes. The first is that I get out of the way of the rook so that when he plays c4, my queen isn't going to be under a lot of pressure. But the second is a little bit more devious. And if my opponent was a little bit more tactically astute, he would have realized that there's something going on here. But even after thinking for a few minutes, he didn't realize the severity of the situation and just played knight to d2, looking to trade off this knight because it's obviously very powerful in the center of the board. But instead of knight to d2, he really should have played queen to c2, bringing the queen back to a more defensive position. But because he didn't, this allows me a very nice tactic. Pause and see if you can find it. And the move that I played here is knight takes f2. Bang. Attacking the rook But the knight can be captured, right? And so he captures it. But now here comes queen takes c3. And now the point behind my earlier move, queen to e7, is revealed. The rook and queen are extremely powerful now on this e-file. And not only is this a check, but I'm actually preparing to take the bishop next. And so after king goes back, only move, I take it. And over the last 3 moves, I sacrificed the knight, but in return I've got 2 pawns and a bishop. Pretty good trade-off. And now he plays king to g1. And although I'm up 2 pawns, I need to continue putting pressure on him. So here I played bishop to h6, putting some pressure on his knight. And here he made another critical mistake. Rather than moving the knight back to something like f1, he thought that he had a little bit of a tactic here. Rook to e1, and it looks like my queen is under attack and the rook is about to get skewered because as soon as the queen moves, the rook is going to be hanging. I never developed my bishop, so the rooks aren't connected. But what he missed is a little bit of an in-between move here. Bishop to e3, which is not only a check, but is also putting the bishop in the way of the queen. And after the king moved into the corner, queen takes d2. And after rook a to d1, just attacking my queen, I moved it off to the side. And it was actually in this position that my opponent resigned the game, because he's simply down a piece and 2 pawns and just has no hope here. I have yet to develop my bishop, and when I do, the attack is going to get that much stronger. And if you were to try to play something like bishop g1, looking to win this bishop back, I could just sidestep with queen to g3. And if you were to try to play c4, it looks like he has enough pressure on the bishop to win it back. But now I had this all worked out, I would have played the amazing bishop takes h3, threatening checkmate. And after pawn takes, it's a mate in 2. Queen takes, bishop h2, and queen f3 mate. So I really just caught my opponent off guard and just pushed the advantage and was able to win a very nice quick game with the black pieces. And because that was such a short game, I decided to include a little bonus segment in this episode, a pretty crazy endgame finesse that I had 2 games later. Now what happened in this game is we had just traded off a pair of rooks, and at this point my Kazakhstani opponent offered me a draw. And I don't know about you, but I'm not one to accept a draw when there's a chance to play for a win. And I just had a feeling that because of the pawn structure and also because of the fact that my opponent had 20 seconds on the clock and I had 2 minutes, I would be able to make of something of this game. And so my opponent here played rook to h3, obviously attacking the pawn. And I, rather than to defend it directly, set a little trap by playing rook to f1. Now if you were to take, I then play king to e2, and it's a discovered check to the king, and I'm picking up this rook. But even with limited time, he didn't fall for this. He simply played king e7, getting his king out of the way, and I played king e2. And he played rook to h2 check. Obviously, if he's able to force a perpetual, then he's not even going to have to get me to accept a draw. It's just going to be one. And so I played king to e3, and after a couple more checks, I was able to evade and get to the queen side. And now he played rook to h3. And it's very unclear on what I could do here. I tried rook to b1, hoping that maybe he would slip up and play rook to g3, and then I could sacrifice this pawn and then push this one through. But obviously, he had it under control. He just played g5. And now if I were to try that, the pawn isn't making there in time because the rook will guard a8. And after rook to a1, he will get in front of my pawn, and now he's winning. And so instead, I brought the rook back to the king side, playing rook to g1, putting pressure on this pawn, baiting him into playing king f6, and now I'm able to make this check, and after king goes back, now my rook sort of invades here. Again, attacking the pawn, he defended it, and now this is where the magic starts to happen. Again, as you can see, the pawn chain looks dead. It looks like I can't really make any progress, but here I played c5, a pawn sacrifice. But the idea is that I'm trying to distract this pawn, so that I can sacrifice here and then push this pawn through. It's a really kind of deep endgame move here. But if he ignores and just plays g4, I can even play b6 here. And again, if he takes with this pawn, I'm going to take here. And after pawn takes, I'm promoting. There's nothing he can do to stop me. So he just took the pawn, but now I take with check, and it's a fork. And after king d6, rook d5 check. He can't go here. He has to go back, and now I take this pawn. And now basically I got 2 pawns to the price of 1. I'm feeling like my chances of winning are starting to improve. But I still got to be careful. He has this pass pawn. So he plays king d7, and I play king to c4, just gradually moving up the board. My king is going to need to be involved in order to win this endgame. He plays g4, and I immediately get in front of his pawn Now if his rook ever moves to the side, I can just take it. And so he moves down, clearing the path for his pawn. I play d4, and he starts to push. And I play king d5, and he pushes again. And it looks very scary. It looks like he's one step away from queening. But like I said, in order to ever queen, his rook is going to have to get out of the way first. And then I'm going to be able to pick this pawn off. So I knew I had this under control. I just played rook to g7 check, forcing his king back. And now I played e5. And here what he probably should have done was played rook to b1, forcing me to take, after which he would then pick off this pawn. And then maybe he could fight for a draw. But instead he played king to c8. And here, believe it or not, I actually missed a forced checkmate. I could have played king to e6, and then this is like almost an unstoppable mate. He would have to give up his pawn here, but then I would just come in with the king, and this is like an unstoppable threat. But I had only about 30 seconds here, and even with 10 seconds increment, it gets pretty nerve-wracking to have that little time. So instead, I just played rook to g8 check, and after king d7, again rook to g7. I'm just kind of repeating moves, trying to get the increment added onto my time so I have more time to figure out the winning move here. And after my opponent went back with his king, now I played e6. This pawn is moving. He has to be careful. He played king to d8, and now again I repeated moves. Rook to g8 check, king to e7, check, king goes back, and now with the clock ticking down, I once again found a brilliant little pawn push. b6. And my opponent here, with very little time, made the critical blunder by taking with the incorrect pawn. C takes b6, and now this allows me to come in with king to d6, creating a mating net around the black king, threatening rook to g8, and my opponent resigned here. There's simply no way to stop this. Only thing he can do to prolong it would be to play rook f1, but after check, rook blocks, this is checkmate. And actually, he could have prolonged the game by taking with the other pawn. If he were to take with the a pawn, this is still much better for white, but it does make it a lot harder. What I would have had to do is then check, and after king moves, I would then push this pawn. And after he comes here, I then take, he takes, but now I check, and after king goes back, I'm able to play king c6, tucking the king in between the pawns, and now threatening to promote this pawn. And after something like rook to a2, looking to remaneuver this rook, check, king here, and then I take this pawn, and I'm going to take this pawn, and these pawns are going to promote. So still not an easy endgame to win, but he could have at least put up a better fight if he had taken with the correct pawn, but he probably thought like, it's just a complete desperate move, right? I'm just going to take it and I'm going to be fine. But he didn't realize here that I had a very serious plan behind my sacrifice, and I was able to finesse and win this endgame after 66 moves. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Road to Rapid Top 1000. Finally back on winning terms, and including this game, I've actually won 3 on the trot. I'm not going to show you my current rating and my ranking just yet. I've played a bunch of games since, so my standings are a little bit outdated, but I will make sure to show you in the next episode. Stay tuned.